The flashbulbs went off like heat lightning the moment my mother stepped up to the podium. I was standing 3 feet behind her, just far enough to be cropped out of the cameras, close enough to hear the shallow breath she always took before she lied. The air smelled like fresh citrus and polished wood, the opening notes of Eclipse already drifting through the room. Reporters leaned forward. Investors smiled. This was supposed to be the moment our family empire crowned its future. Vivian Sterling lifted her chin and said, clearly and calmly, "This masterpiece belongs to my eldest daughter, Claire. She is the creative genius behind everything you're about to experience." Applause thundered through the hall. My stomach dropped, not because I was surprised, but because I knew exactly what she was doing. 3 years of my work disappeared in one sentence. I felt it happen in real time, like someone erasing my name from my own life. I stepped forward, just one step. I opened my mouth. Something cold pierced my arm. I remember the sound first, a soft click, almost polite. Then the room tilted. The light smeared. My legs folded under me as if they'd been unplugged. I hit the floor hard enough that the cameras caught it, hard enough that gasps rippled through the crowd. As everything blurred, my sister knelt beside me. Her perfume was sweet, too sweet. She leaned close and whispered, almost gently, "You're about to be locked in a mental hospital long term." That was when I understood this wasn't a betrayal. It was an execution. I came to in pieces, my body heavy, my thoughts slow, as if someone had stuffed cotton between them. Voices floated above me, clinical and unconcerned. By the time my eyes opened fully, I was no longer in the exhibition hall. I was in a white room with no windows and restraints around my wrists. My name was written on a clipboard at the foot of the bed. Under it, in neat handwriting, was a diagnosis I'd never been given. Audrey Sterling, emotional instability, acute episode. Sterling & Co. had been built on the illusion of elegance, generations of careful branding, glass bottles, and legacy stories. To the outside world, we were refinement itself. Inside the family, refinement meant control, and control meant deciding who mattered. I was the youngest daughter, the quiet one, the one who worked late and spoke little. Vivian liked to say I supported Claire's vision, that I assisted, that I helped refine ideas that already existed. It was a convenient way to explain why I was always there and never credited. Eclipse was different. Eclipse was mine. I had developed the formula alone, late nights in a private lab, adjusting ratios until the scent held its shape instead of collapsing. I never told my mother how long it took. I already knew how she would use that information. The launch had been scheduled down to the minute. Media from 3 continents. Analysts in the front row. It wasn't just a product debut. It was a declaration of succession. And somewhere along the way, Vivian had decided I could not be allowed to speak during it. As consciousness settled back into my body, I noticed the details. The door that locked from the outside, the camera in the corner. The way the nurse spoke, slowly, carefully, like I was a child who might shatter if addressed directly. "You had an episode," she said. "Your family was very concerned." Concerned. That was the word my mother used when she wanted someone neutralized. Concerned meant papers signed while you were unconscious. Concerned meant the story had already been told, and you were expected to play your part. Later, when they wheeled me down a long corridor that smelled of disinfectant and something older underneath it, I caught my reflection in a strip of glass. My hair was tangled. There was a bruise forming on my arm where the needle had gone in. I looked exactly like the story they were telling. Somewhere beyond those walls, Claire was being congratulated. Vivian was shaking hands. Eclipse was being sprayed onto silk scarves and smiling wrists. The world was learning a name that wasn't mine, and I was being locked away before I could say otherwise. Lying there, listening to the distant echo of doors closing, I realized something else. The injection hadn't been rushed. The paperwork hadn't been improvised. The timing was too precise. This had been planned long before the cameras arrived. They hadn't silenced me because I was unstable. They silenced me because something was about to change. I didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know why now. All I knew was that my mother had decided my voice was dangerous enough to drug, to erase, to bury behind locked doors. So I closed my eyes and let them think I was gone. Silence, I would learn, can be many things. And sometimes it's the most lethal weapon of all. I woke up to the sound of fabric tearing. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, that half state where your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. Then I felt the pressure on my wrists, the rough bite of restraint straps tightening as I moved, and the smell of antiseptic snapped everything into focus. I was flat on my back in a narrow bed, white ceiling, white walls, no windows, a camera dome tucked into the corner like an unblinking eye. When I tried to lift my head, nausea rolled through me in a thick, dizzy wave. "Easy," a voice said. Calm, female, practiced. "You're safe." Safe was the word they always used when you weren't. My throat felt coated, dry, and chemical. I swallowed and tasted metal. When I spoke, my voice came out thin and unfamiliar. "Where am I?" The nurse glanced at a chart before she looked at me. That told me everything. "You're at Fog Valley Psychiatric Center, Audrey. You had an episode. Your family brought you here for evaluation." Evaluation. Another soft word. Another lie wrapped in cotton. I turned my head as far as the restraints allowed. The door was solid, reinforced, with a narrow observation window. No handle on my side. On the wall opposite the bed was a laminated schedule. Medication times, group therapy, quiet hours. Compliance laid out neatly in bullet points. They unfastened the restraints after a while, once I stopped struggling. I learned quickly that stillness was rewarded. Movement earned looks. Questions earned notes scribbled on the chart. A doctor came in mid-morning, middle-aged, polite smile. He introduced himself without shaking my hand. He spoke slowly, like I might miss words if he went too fast. "You've been experiencing delusions tied to professional jealousy," he said. "Your mother shared your history with us. Mood instability, fixation, difficulty accepting boundaries." I stared at him. My own life, summarized and repackaged. "That's not true," I said. He nodded, as if I had confirmed something important. "That's exactly how it feels when you're in it." That was my first lesson. Everything I said would be used against me. Not legally, clinically, a much cleaner trap. They started the medication that afternoon. Small paper cup, 2 pills, pale blue and white. The nurse watched until I swallowed. Within an hour, my thoughts softened at the edges. Not asleep, not awake, just dulled, like someone had turned down the volume on my own mind. The feeling was disturbingly familiar. By evening, the walls seemed to breathe when I stared too long. Sounds echoed half a second late. I felt detached from my own body, like I was observing myself from a few feet behind my eyes. I remembered the supplements my mother used to insist I take every morning: herbal blends, focus aids, calmatives. She said they helped with my sensitivity, with my tendency to overthink. I had trusted her. She was my mother. Lying in that bed, with the fog pressing in from all sides, I wondered how long this had really been happening. The ward itself was quiet in a way that felt wrong. No screaming, no chaos, just a low hum of routine. Patients shuffled from room to room, medicated into compliance. Most avoided eye contact. A few watched everything. There was an older woman who sat by the window during recreation hour, her hands folded in her lap. She looked at me the first time I joined the group, really looked, not like the staff did. When a nurse turned away, she leaned closer and whispered, "Don't fight them." I didn't answer. "They don't let fighters stay," she added. "They make them disappear." That night, Another bed down the hall was empty. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. Fear settled into me then, not sharp but heavy. This place wasn't designed to help anyone leave. It was designed to keep people contained, documented, explained away. So I stopped arguing. I answered questions carefully. I thanked nurses. I took notes during group therapy. I said I felt better. I said the medication was helping. I learned which phrases made them smile and which made them frown. Inside, I watched everything. I learned the shift changes. I learned which staff members skim charts and which read them closely. I learned how often rooms were searched and how thorough those searches really were. I learned that improvement earned privileges and privileges earned privacy. At night, when the lights dimmed and the hallway quieted, I lay awake and let the fog lift just enough to think. This hadn't happened because I collapsed at a press conference. That was just the cover story. The speed of it, the coordination, the paperwork already prepared, told me the truth. My mother had been waiting for a moment when she could remove me completely, with witnesses, with sympathy, with no chance for rebuttal. Waiting until the story would be believed without question. Whatever I had almost stepped into that day, whatever was about to shift in my favor, she had seen it coming before I did, and she had decided I could not be allowed to reach it. So I lay still, staring at the dark ceiling, and made a choice of my own. If they wanted a compliant daughter, I would give them one. If they wanted silence, I would master it. Because silence, used correctly, does not mean surrender. It means waiting. The first sign that something had changed was the way the nurses avoided my eyes. It was subtle. A pause before answering, a glance toward the camera before speaking. By then, I had learned to read the rhythms of Fog Valley, and this wasn't part of the routine. When they told me I had a visitor, they didn't say family. They didn't smile. "He's not on your usual list," the nurse said. "Just answer his questions calmly." I was escorted down a different corridor than usual, past offices I hadn't seen before, into a small interview room with a metal table bolted to the floor. There were 2 chairs. One for me, one already occupied. He stood when I entered, mid-40s, dark suit, no tie, the kind of calm that comes from being used to hostile rooms. He didn't look at the restraints on my wrists. He looked at my face. "Audrey Sterling," he said. "I'm Julian Vance." The name landed with weight. CEO of Vance Parfums, our largest competitor, the man my mother called a vulture in board meetings. "You shouldn't be here," I said carefully. He gave a small smile. "Neither should you." The nurse lingered at the door. Julian waited until she stepped outside and closed it. The moment it latched, his expression shifted. The performance dropped. "I don't have much time," he said, "and neither do you." I said nothing. Silence had become second nature. Julian leaned forward. "Your father's will was never executed the way your mother claimed. There is a sealed clause. It transfers 51% of Sterling & Co. to you when you turn 27. My chest tightened. "That's not possible." "It is," he said, "and it activates automatically. No board vote, no discretion." A beat passed, then another. "When?" I asked. "In 6 days." The room seemed to tilt, not from medication this time, but from clarity. The press conference, the injection, the speed with which I had been declared unstable. Vivian hadn't acted out of emotion. She had acted on a deadline. "She knew," I said. "She suspected," Julian corrected. "Your father was meticulous. He left contingencies. He anticipated resistance." My hands curled into fists under the table. "How do you know this?" "Because the trust administrator reached out to us when Sterling stocks started behaving strangely," Julian said. "And because your mother has been liquidating assets quietly for months. My collapse hadn't been spontaneous. It had been preventative." Julian reached into his jacket and placed a small USB drive on the table, covering it with his palm. This contains copies of your medical records, internal correspondence, and financial transfers authorized by Vivian Sterling. I stared at it. Why are you telling me this? Because I need something from you, he said evenly. And because you need to get out of here alive. He didn't soften it. He didn't pretend this was altruism. For 12 years, he continued, you've been administered a compound disguised as supplements, low-dose hallucinogenic stabilizers, enough to impair clarity, enough to justify a diagnosis. The same physician has overseen it the entire time. Dr. Aris, the family doctor, the man who had smiled as he injected me on stage. My stomach turned. Memories rearranged themselves. The fog, the doubt, the moments I'd blamed on myself. You're not ill, Julian said. You were managed. I closed my eyes for a second. When I opened them, I felt sharper than I had in years. What do you want? I asked. Your formula, he said. The real one, not what your sister presented. I laughed once, quietly. You want me to trade one thief for another. I want to burn your mother's leverage before she can consolidate it, Julian said. And you want the same thing. He wasn't wrong. I just hated that he knew it. I can get you out, he said. But not yet. If you leave now, she claims relapse. You disappear legally. He slid the USB toward me an inch. You stay, you play along, you let them think it worked. And in return, I said. In return, I wait, Julian said, and I prepare. The door handle rattled. The nurse's shadow appeared through the frosted glass. Julian stood. You'll find the drive tape beneath the third drawer in your room. I won't mention it again. The nurse re-entered. Julian smiled politely, thanked her, and left without another glance at me. Back in my room, the air felt different, charged, dangerous. That night, when the ward quieted, I knelt beside my bed and slid my fingers under the drawer. The tape was exactly where he said it would be. I held the USB in my palm, small and unremarkable, and understood its weight. Proof, leverage, a weapon. From that moment on, the staff watched me more closely. Too closely. I had been flagged. So I adjusted. I smiled more. I agreed faster. I swallowed pills in front of witnesses. And later, alone, I made sure they didn't stay inside me. I wasn't pretending to be broken anymore. I was pretending not to be powerful, because now I knew the truth. My mother hadn't locked me away because I was unstable. She had locked me away because in 6 days I would own her empire. And that terrified her. I learned very quickly that survival in Fog Valley depended on how convincing your silence was. The day after Julian's visit, I stopped asking questions altogether. I thanked the nurses by name. I nodded during evaluations. I said the medication was helping, that the noise in my head had quieted. I watched the way their shoulders relaxed when I complied, how tension melted when I became easy. Being easy was rewarded. Privileges followed, an extra 10 minutes outside during rec time, a pen instead of a crayon during group therapy, less frequent room checks. Each concession told me the same thing. They wanted me stable, manageable, forgotten. So I gave them exactly what they needed to see. I learned the choreography of a patient who wasn't going anywhere. I mirrored the posture of the women who had been there the longest, the ones who moved slowly and spoke softly and never startled anyone. I practiced the language they liked: progress, acceptance, insight. When I spoke, I framed my thoughts as concerns about myself, never accusations about others. Madness, I realized, wasn't about symptoms. It was about inconvenience. The medication schedule never changed. Morning dose, evening dose. Always supervised, always logged. The first night I tried to fight it, I spent hours shaking in the bathroom, sweating through my clothes, the taste of chemicals burning my throat. The second night, I figured out how to make it look convincing. I let the pills dissolve under my tongue just long enough to leave a residue. Then I excused myself to the bathroom, leaned over the toilet, and purged them quietly. My hands trembled so badly I had to brace my elbow against the wall. My body protested, confused by the sudden absence of a substance it had been fed for years. It was ugly. It was painful. It worked. By the fourth night, the fog began to lift. Colors sharpened. Sounds snapped back into focus. Thoughts lined up instead of drifting. With clarity came anger, and with anger came discipline. I could not afford mistakes. I saw what happened to people who made them. A man 2 rooms down refused his medication one morning. He raised his voice. Nothing dramatic, just loud enough to be noticed. By evening his door was locked, and by morning his bed was empty. No explanation, no transfer announcement, just absence. The older woman by the window didn't look surprised when she noticed. "Don't rush it," she murmured when we passed in the hall. "They always think they have time." I nodded once and kept walking. The USB was my constant fear. I could feel its presence even when it wasn't on me. After a routine inspection came too close to its hiding place, I moved it. Carefully. I wrapped it in tissue and secured it where only I would ever think to look. Something intimate enough to avoid suspicion. Something degrading enough that no one would search it thoroughly. The irony wasn't lost on me. At night, memories returned that I hadn't realized were missing. Arguments I couldn't quite recall before. Moments where my mother's voice had sounded too calm, too rehearsed. The steady insistence that I needed help, that I wasn't well, that I should trust her. I had trusted her. The realization didn't make me cry. It hardened something inside me. Grief would have to wait. Right now, clarity was more important. I began counting days in my head, not by numbers, but by routines. 2 more medication cycles, 3 more evaluations, 1 more meeting with the head psychiatrist before the weekend. Somewhere beyond these walls, a calendar was inching closer to my birthday. I wondered if Vivian was counting too. The staff's attention sharpened as the days passed. More check-ins, more notes on my chart. Praise that felt rehearsed. They were preparing something, a decision, a designation that would make my stay indefinite. I smiled through all of it. I attended a group session where we were asked to describe our goals. When it was my turn, I said I wanted peace, stability, a quiet life. The therapist beamed like I'd said the magic words. That night, alone in my room, I stared at my reflection in the small mirror bolted to the wall. My face looked calmer, thinner, older somehow. The version of me they saw looked diminished. The version they couldn't see was awake, sharp, and very patient. I swallowed the pills in front of the nurse, opened my mouth to show compliance, then turned away and disposed of them in the privacy of the bathroom. My body protested less now. It was remembering itself. I lay back on the bed and listened to the hum of the building settle into night mode. Somewhere keys rattled. Doors locked. Cameras whirred softly. They thought they had me contained. They thought I was broken enough to forget who I was. But silence, when chosen, is not submission. It is preparation. And while they documented my compliance and praised my improvement, I was becoming something far more dangerous than a difficult daughter. I was becoming invisible. The television in the common room was never meant for news. It usually played daytime talk shows or nature documentaries, harmless noise to keep us docile. That morning, someone forgot to change the channel. I was sitting on a vinyl chair, hands folded, eyes lowered, when the Sterling & Co. logo filled the screen. "Global launch confirmed," the anchor said brightly. "Eclipse will debut worldwide this Friday." I didn't move. I didn't react. Inside, everything aligned with a quiet, perfect click. They hadn't just locked me away. They had scheduled me. The timing was too clean to ignore. The press conference, my collapse, the diagnosis. Now this. Eclipse wasn't just a product. It was the fuse, and they had removed me from the room before lighting it. I let my gaze stay unfocused as footage rolled of Claire smiling for cameras, her hand resting possessively on a bottle she didn't understand. The commentators praised the complexity of the opening notes, the confidence of the composition. They talked about legacy, about vision. They didn't talk about stability. I reconstructed the formula in my head the way I always did when I needed grounding. Top notes, heart, bass. The balance I'd fought for over 3 years. And then the absence, glaring and inevitable. The stabilizing compound I'd never shared. The one that kept the scent from turning once oxygen and time did their work. Without it, Eclipse would shine for exactly 7 days. After that, it would rot. The realization didn't thrill me. It steadied me. There was a difference. I could have stopped it. That truth sat heavy and undeniable. I could have warned someone, leaked a concern, caused a delay. But delay would only soften the impact. Failure needed an audience. Success needed to come first. I wasn't interested in a quiet correction. I wanted collapse. That afternoon, during a rare moment of privacy, I found a way to send a message through the narrow channel Julian had left open. It was brief, coded, no names, no specifics. Let it launch. Don't intervene. Let them sell everything they can. The response came hours later, a single confirmation, position set, timing aligned. Revenge, I was learning, worked best when it looked like math. Inside Fog Valley, the atmosphere shifted as the launch approached. The staff smiled more. They congratulated me on my progress. I was offered supervised walks outside the building, a bench in the weak winter sun. Privileges dangled like rewards for good behavior. They were confident now. They thought the risk had passed. During one evaluation, the head psychiatrist leaned back in his chair and said, "Your family is relieved. They feel you're finally accepting reality." I nodded. Acceptance was such a flexible word. Each day, I counted without counting. Day 1, the perfume-filled warehouses. Day 2, it hit shelves. Day 3, influencers praised it. Day 4, pre-orders doubled. Day 5, Vivian appeared on another interview, radiant and untouchable. My body felt stronger with every purged dose. My mind was sharp enough to hurt. At night, I lay awake and imagined the chemical breakdown I knew was already in motion. I could see it the way I saw formulas, invisible but precise. On the 6th day, the mood inside the ward changed again. I overheard 2 nurses whispering at the desk, my name threaded into the conversation like a warning. Vivian had called, not once, repeatedly. She wanted updates, reassurance, control. They were afraid she would come in person. That fear told me everything I needed to know. Even drugged and locked away, I was still a variable she couldn't eliminate. That evening, I caught a glimpse of a celebration on the television. Champagne flutes, a banner behind Claire that read, "A New Era." Vivian stood beside her, one hand gripping her daughter's shoulder, the other raised in a toast. They looked invincible. I felt nothing. Julian's signal came just before lights out, a single line that carried more weight than any speech. "Be ready. Extraction will be immediate." Immediate meant dangerous. It meant once the truth surfaced, I would no longer be useful to them alive. Not here. Not anywhere. I lay back on my pillow and stared at the ceiling, fully awake, fully present. For the first time since the press conference, I allowed myself a single, slow breath. They had built their triumph on my silence. They had mistaken compliance for weakness. Tomorrow, the 7th day would arrive, the point of no return, the moment when chemistry stopped being patient and told the truth instead. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to wait. Tomorrow, the lie wouldn't crack. It would stink. By the time the seventh day arrived, the world outside Fog Valley had already crowned a winner. Every screen I passed showed the same images. Claire laughing into microphones, Vivian gliding just out of frame, correcting a phrase here, adjusting a story there, headlines scrolled beneath them in bright, confident fonts. A triumph, a rebirth, Sterling and Company, unstoppable. I watched without expression, hands folded in my lap, the picture of calm compliance. Inside, I counted. Success makes people sloppy. I'd learned that early, long before perfume in boardrooms. When victory feels guaranteed, caution looks unnecessary. Vivian had always been most dangerous when she felt threatened. Now she felt safe. Inside the ward, that safety translated into pressure. The staff checked on me more often, not out of concern, but vigilance. My chart thickened. Notes were added in careful handwriting. Progress maintained. Insight improving. Continued supervision recommended. The language was polite, but the intention was clear. They weren't planning my release. They were planning permanence. One afternoon, the head psychiatrist sat across from me and said, "Your family is discussing long-term options." He said it gently, as if he were offering a gift. "Stability is important," he continued. "We don't want you relapsing once the stress of the outside world returns." I smiled at the right moments. I thanked him for his care. I agreed that stability mattered. What I didn't say was that the stress he was talking about was already eating them alive. Vivian's calls to the facility increased. I didn't hear her voice, but I saw the effects. Staff huddled, administrators whispered, protocols tightened. Whatever she sensed, she couldn't name it yet. Fear without shape is the most exhausting kind. That night I slept lightly, aware of every sound. Keys, footsteps, the low mechanical sigh of locked doors resetting. My body was fully my own now. The last traces of chemical fog burned away by discipline and patience. In the early hours, I stood at the small window in the common area and watched dawn bleed into the sky. Somewhere far away, Sterling and Company was preparing another celebration, another announcement, another victory lap. They were celebrating a future that no longer existed. On the morning news, an analyst praised Eclipse's staying power. "It's holding beautifully," he said. "The market response has been extraordinary." I almost smiled. The institution felt tighter as the day wore on, like a room with shrinking walls. Evaluations were moved up. Questions repeated, the same ones asked in slightly different ways, searching for inconsistency. I gave them none. By afternoon, the tension became visible. A nurse dropped a tray and cursed under her breath. Another whispered urgently into a phone behind the desk. My name floated through the air like static. Julian's message came through the channel we'd agreed on, stripped down to essentials. Positions active, media ready, move when it breaks. When, not if. I sat through dinner as usual, chewing mechanically, tasting nothing. Across the room, a television replayed footage from a morning show. Claire sprayed Eclipse onto her wrist, laughed, lifted it to her nose. The moment hadn't happened yet. I knew the timeline. I knew the chemistry, oxygen exposure, skin heat, time. There was no improvising your way out of it once the reaction began. Late in the evening, I overheard raised voices near the nurse's station. Vivian again, demanding updates, demanding reassurance, demanding control she could no longer enforce. That was when I understood something else. Even now, even with everything stacked in her favor, she didn't trust the silence she'd forced on me. Some part of her remembered who I was before the fog, before the pills, before the obedience. That memory was haunting her. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, fully dressed, fully alert. If extraction had to be immediate, there would be no warning, no goodbyes, no time to gather courage. Courage had already been spent. I thought briefly of my father, of the man who had left me power disguised as patience. I thought of the years I'd lost to doubt, to a voice that wasn't mine telling me I was too much or not enough. I didn't feel rage. Rage was loud. This was quieter, cleaner. Near midnight, the building settled into its lowest hum, the kind of stillness that comes before systems fail. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, hands resting loosely at my sides. Tomorrow, the scent would turn. Tomorrow, the lie would reveal itself to everyone who had applauded it. And when it did, Vivian Sterling would finally understand the cost of silencing the wrong daughter. I closed my eyes, not to escape, but to focus. The night before collapse is always deceptively calm. It smells like confidence, and it never lasts. I woke before the alarms, before the staff changed shifts, before the 7th day officially began. There was no fog left in my head, no dull ache behind my eyes. I felt sharp, alert, painfully present. Whatever they had tried to turn me into had burned away, leaving only the version of me they should have been afraid of all along. In the common room, the television was already tuned to the live broadcast. Claire stood under white lights, dressed in ivory, holding the Eclipse bottle like it was a crown. The studio buzzed with practiced excitement. Hosts leaned in, viewers poured in by the millions. Vivian hovered just outside the frame, directing with a tilt of her chin, a flick of her hand. I sat down slowly, my pulse steady. Claire lifted the bottle and sprayed the perfume onto her wrist. The first reactions were exactly what I expected. Smiles, approval. Words like luminous and bold floated through the air. Someone commented on the complexity of the opening notes. I noted the timestamp on the corner of the screen. For a moment, nothing happened. That was always the danger. The pause that made people doubt their instincts. The delay that convinced them everything was fine. Then Claire's smile faltered. It was subtle at first, just a tightening around her eyes. She brought her wrist closer to her nose, sniffed again. The host leaned forward, laughing, assuming it was part of the performance. Claire laughed too, but it came out thin. Another sniff, another second. The scent turned. Even through the screen, I could see it land on her. The confusion, the reflexive attempt to hide it. She shifted, trying to move away from the host, but the cameras followed her instinctively. "What is that?" someone murmured off-screen. The comments exploded. Viewers joked at first, then questioned, then recoiled. The host stalled, scrambling for language that didn't exist. Vivian stepped into frame. She leaned in, took the bottle, sprayed it onto her own hand. I watched her face as the realization hit, fast and absolute. There was no mask strong enough for that moment. Her voice cut through the studio, sharp and uncontrolled. "Who betrayed me?" The scream echoed through the ward like a gunshot. The broadcast descended into chaos. Producers shouted, cameras wobbled, social feeds flooded with clips, memes, speculation. Analysts interrupted programming as Sterling and co-stock began to plummet in real time. Trading halted. I felt a hand on my shoulder, a nurse, pale, shaken. "You need to come with us," she said. I stood without resistance. They brought me to a private room I'd never seen before. 10 minutes later, the doors flew open and Vivian stormed in, Claire trailing behind her, eyes red, makeup smeared, the smell of failure clinging to her clothes. "Fix it," Vivian demanded, pointing at me like I was still something she owned. "You did this. You fix it." I looked at her calmly. "There's nothing to fix." Claire's voice broke. "Audrey, please. They're canceling contracts. They're calling it fraud." I met her eyes. "You stole an unfinished formula." Vivian slammed her hand on the table. "You're sick. You've always been sick." "No," I said quietly. "I was drugged." The door opened again. Julian Vance walked in, flanked by 2 men in tailored suits. He placed a folder on the table and slid it toward Vivian. "Sterling and Company no longer belongs to you." he said evenly. As of today, 51% of the company is under new ownership. Vivian stared at the papers, then at me. What is this? She whispered. My birthday clause, I said. The one you tried to outrun. The color drained from her face. Julian continued. We acquired the remaining shares during the market drop, cleanly, legally. Claire sank into a chair, sobbing. Vivian said nothing. She couldn't. For the first time in my life, she had no story prepared. I stood. You locked me away to silence me. You poisoned me to control me, and you did it because you were afraid. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. I felt no triumph, only finality. As they escorted Vivian and Claire out, I remained where I was, breathing evenly, grounded in my own body. The empire hadn't collapsed in flames. It had rotted, exactly as designed, and I was still standing when the smell finally cleared. The silence after everything fell apart was almost gentle. Vivian didn't scream when the police arrived at the boardroom 2 hours later. She didn't argue. She didn't perform. She sat very still while officers read charges that sounded unreal even to me. Fraud, medical abuse, intentional harm. Words that had followed me for years finally detached themselves from my name and landed where they belonged. Claire wasn't taken away in handcuffs. She didn't need to be. Watching her signature stripped from company records was punishment enough. By the end of the day, her access was revoked, her accounts frozen, her reputation hollowed out in a way no statement could fix. The world that had applauded her genius moved on with impressive speed. I stood at the head of the table while the board recalibrated around me. They didn't clap. They didn't congratulate. They studied me with the kind of attention reserved for permanence. Ownership was confirmed, votes were tallied, Julian's role was acknowledged, and then stepped back. This wasn't his story to tell. When it was over, I walked out alone. The next weeks passed quietly. Sterling and Company didn't collapse. It changed. I dismantled the structures my mother had used to control people. I fired executives who thrived on fear. I rebuilt labs. I rewrote contracts. I made transparency boring and accountability unavoidable. I didn't give interviews. I didn't explain myself. I let the facts speak in their own steady voice. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Dr. Aris turned evidence in exchange for leniency. Video footage surfaced that no amount of money could erase. Vivian's image, once untouchable, unraveled frame by frame. The woman who had narrated every room she entered was finally reduced to listening. A year later, I stood in a different space, holding a different bottle. The Phoenix wasn't announced with fanfare. No press conference, no speeches about legacy. It arrived quietly on shelves, accompanied only by a short note about craftsmanship and patience. People noticed anyway. They always do when something is real. The scent didn't change after 7 days, or 14, or 30. It held. Julian and I never pretended our alliance was romantic or heroic. It was precise, effective. When it ended cleanly. We respected what we had built and what we hadn't. Vivian lost everything she valued: control, reputation, the ability to rewrite the past. Claire took a job far from glass offices and curated kitchens, working under someone who didn't know her last name. I didn't interfere. Consequences don't need help. What surprised me most was the absence of hate. Hate is heavy. I'd carried enough weight already. What I kept instead was clarity. I learned that silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's strategy. The loudest response I ever gave my family wasn't an argument or a lawsuit. It was letting their lies collapse under the weight of time and truth. I learned that you don't owe anyone a confrontation. You owe yourself honesty. The moment I stopped trying to convince them of who I was, I became impossible to control, and I learned that boundaries aren't walls. They're doors with better locks. My mother can knock. She just can't rearrange the furniture anymore. I'm sitting in my office now, windows open, the city breathing below. There's a cup of tea on my desk that's gone cold while I've been talking to you. I don't mind. Some things are worth lingering over. If you've ever had someone take credit for your work, rewrite your story, or label you unstable because it was easier than facing the truth, I'd like to hear from you. Drop your experience in the comments. You might be surprised how many people recognize it. And if this story stayed with you, if quiet revenge and earned justice are the kinds of stories you want more of, stay here, subscribe. There are more coming. Sometimes the most powerful comeback isn't loud. It's living well, telling the truth, and deciding who gets the key. This narrative is dramatized for storytelling impact.